June 1941, the world stood on the edge of chaos. For nearly 2 years, Adolf Hitler had dominated Europe. His armies had crushed Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, the Low Countries, leaving only Britain defiant across the Channel. To the west, Nazi power seemed unstoppable, but behind the facade of triumph, Hitler's eyes turned eastward toward the vast, frozen empire of the Soviet Union. This new campaign would be unlike anything before. Its name, Operation Barbarossa. The seeds of this catastrophe were planted long before the first shot was fired. Hitler's hatred of communism and his obsession with Lebensraum, living space for the German people, drove his every decision. In his twisted vision, conquering the East would secure Germany's future, crush the Soviet regime, and provide endless land, resources, and slaves for his Reich. But beneath the arrogance, danger brewed. The Nazi war machine, though powerful, was stretched thin. Supplies were limited, fuel reserves low, and German soldiers had already been fighting without rest since 1939. Even so, Hitler was convinced that one swift, brutal strike could destroy the Red Army before it had time to react. He ignored his generals' warnings, he underestimated the enemy, and he misjudged the land itself. In secret, German forces began preparing the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 3,500 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft gathered along the 180-mile border separating Nazi-occupied Europe from Soviet territory. It was a force so vast, so monstrous, that it defied imagination. But to the east, the Soviets were not blind. Joseph Stalin had received countless warnings from spies, from Britain, even from his own intelligence network, all predicting a German attack. Yet Stalin refused to believe them. He trusted the 1939 Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, the very agreement that had allowed Germany and the USSR to carve up Poland together. In his mind, Hitler wouldn't risk a two-front war, not while Britain still stood undefeated. He was wrong. As spring turned to summer in 1941, German troops grew restless. Commanders finalized invasion maps, engineers built bridges across rivers, and Luftwaffe pilots trained for lightning strikes deep inside Soviet airspace. The Wehrmacht's confidence was absolute. To them, this was another quick campaign. 6 weeks, perhaps 8, just like France. But what they were about to face would not be another France. It would be something far worse. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the silence of the eastern frontier shattered. The roar of artillery, the scream of aircraft, and the thunder of tanks announced the beginning of the most brutal campaign of the Second World War. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and with it began the slow, bloody downfall of Nazi Germany. The world's largest invasion had begun. Without a formal declaration of war, Germany unleashed its fury upon the Soviet Union. The skies were filled with the roar of Luftwaffe bombers, and the earth trembled under the rumble of tanks and artillery. In one morning, Hitler's dream of conquering the East became a reality, and the nightmare of millions began. The attack stretched across an immense 180-mile front, divided into 3 massive army groups, each with a specific mission designed to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. To the north, Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, stormed toward Leningrad, the cradle of the Russian Revolution. Their goal: seize the city and cut off the Soviet Baltic Fleet. In the center, Army Group Center, under Fedor von Bock, prepared the most powerful thrust, a lightning strike toward Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union. It was the largest concentration of armor the world had ever seen. And to the south, Army Group South, commanded by Gerd von Rundstedt, pushed toward the fertile lands of Ukraine, the breadbasket of the USSR, and the vital oil fields beyond. Together, these forces represented Hitler's ultimate gamble to destroy the Red Army in a single, swift blow. The surprise was total. Soviet border troops were caught in their barracks. Aircraft lined up neatly on runways were obliterated before they could take off. Within hours, the Luftwaffe claimed over 1,000 Soviet planes destroyed. German armor advanced with breathtaking speed, slicing through Soviet lines. surrounding entire divisions, and capturing thousands of prisoners. Hitler was ecstatic. In Berlin, he declared that the Bolshevik Colossus had been struck a mortal blow. Propaganda painted the invasion as a crusade against communism, a holy war to save Europe from Stalin's tyranny. But behind the propaganda lay a darker truth. The invasion wasn't just military, it was ideological. Hitler had ordered his troops to show no mercy. Political commissars were to be executed on sight. Entire villages were burned. Civilians suspected of resistance were massacred. Barbarossa was not a conventional war. It was a war of annihilation. Yet, even amid the chaos, the Soviets refused to collapse. Though unprepared and disorganized, countless soldiers stood their ground in hopeless battles. In Brest, a small Soviet garrison fought to the last man. Their fortress walls, scarred with bullet holes that still bear the inscription, "I am dying, but I will not surrender." As the days turned to weeks, the German advance seemed unstoppable. Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk fell one after another. Tens of thousands of Soviet troops were captured in massive encirclements. But despite the victories, one thing became clear. The deeper the Wehrmacht pushed into the Soviet Union, the more stretched its supply lines became. As German panzers thundered deeper into Soviet territory, it seemed as though nothing could stop them. Town after town fell in flames, and entire Soviet divisions vanished in the vast encirclements of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. The Wehrmacht's confidence grew with every mile. To the German high command, the war in the east looked almost won, but beneath the surface, a storm was gathering, one that would soon turn Hitler's triumph into despair. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin, stunned by the invasion's brutality, had vanished from public view for days. His silence fueled panic across the Soviet Union, but when he finally re-emerged, it was with renewed determination. "Comrades, brothers and sisters, rise up to defend the motherland," he proclaimed over the radio. "This is not a war for territory, it is a war for our very survival." That speech ignited a flame across the nation. From farmers to factory workers, from soldiers to students, the Soviet people rallied to defend their homeland. Factories were dismantled and moved thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Women and children labored day and night, forging tanks, shells, and rifles in the frozen heart of Siberia. The Red Army, though bloodied and battered, began to fight back. New divisions were raised in the millions. Soviet generals like Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky reorganized what remained of their shattered armies. Fresh recruits, many with barely a week's training, were thrown into the front lines armed with old rifles, or sometimes none at all. Yet what they lacked in weapons, they made up for in will. By August 1941, the Germans had advanced hundreds of miles, but their pace slowed. Roads turned to mud after the summer rains, and supply lines stretched to breaking. Tanks ran out of fuel, trucks broke down, and soldiers scavenged for food. Still, Hitler pushed his commanders forward. He demanded Moscow. He demanded victory. But the Red Army was no longer collapsing, it was adapting. In places like Yelnya, Soviet counterattacks began to stall German advances. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was starting to crack. And behind enemy lines, a new force was rising. The Soviet partisans, armed with little more than captured rifles and homemade explosives. They struck supply convoys, derailed trains, and ambushed patrols in the forests. Every mile the Germans advanced came at a higher cost. Meanwhile, German soldiers began to realize the scale of the land they had invaded. Villages stretched endlessly, the road seemed to have no end, and the sky felt larger and more hostile than any they had seen in Europe. They were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by an enemy who refused to surrender. Hitler believed he was fighting a short war, but by the fall of 1941, he was already trapped in a long one. The Red Army, though scarred and weary, had survived the initial storm. Now, with winter approaching, nature itself would join the fight. By late November 1941, the German army stood at the very threshold of Moscow. After months of brutal fighting and endless marching across the vast Russian plains, the Wehrmacht could now see the faint outlines of the Soviet capital on the horizon. For Hitler, it was the moment of destiny, the ultimate prize that would prove his empire invincible. But what he didn't realize was that the closer his armies came to Moscow, the more everything began to fall apart. The German troops were exhausted, underfed, and ill-equipped for the harsh Russian winter. They had marched over 1,000 miles since June. Their boots were worn thin, their engines froze overnight, and their weapons jammed in the biting cold. The temperature dropped to -30°C, and still, the soldiers pressed on, driven by sheer will, not by strategy. Hitler was obsessed. He refused to retreat. He ordered his generals to advance, no matter the cost. As the Germans pushed forward, Soviet defenses stiffened. Moscow, now declared a fortress city, was surrounded by trenches, barbed wire, and anti-tank obstacles. Every man, woman, and child was mobilized. Students dug ditches. Women filled sandbags. Even the elderly stood guard with rifles. Stalin himself refused to leave the capital. He told his commanders, "There is no land beyond the Volga. Moscow will not fall." By early December, the Germans were only 20 miles from the Kremlin. Through binoculars, they could see the city's spires, and the faint glow of anti-aircraft fire lighting up the night sky. Victory seemed within reach. But then, the weather turned against them completely. Blizzards swept across the front, burying tanks in snow and freezing entire divisions. German vehicles couldn't start, artillery refused to fire, and soldiers froze to death in their trenches. The mighty Wehrmacht, the same army that had conquered all of Europe, was now helpless against the Russian winter. Meanwhile, Stalin unleashed his secret weapon. From the Far East came Siberian divisions, elite troops, hardened by sub-zero conditions and trained in winter warfare. Their arrival stunned the Germans. Clad in white camouflage, riding on skis, they struck like ghosts through the snow. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. It was the first time in the war that Hitler's army was forced to retreat on a large scale. The Germans, caught completely off guard, fell back in chaos. Entire units froze or were wiped out in desperate rearguard actions. For the first time, the myth of the invincible Nazi war machine was shattered. The gates of Moscow had become a graveyard of ambition. Operation Barbarossa had failed to achieve its goal, and the world began to see the truth. Hitler's war in the East was far from over, but his dream of a quick victory was dead. The tide of war was beginning to turn. The German dream of taking Moscow had died in the snow. By December 1941, the once proud Wehrmacht, the most feared army in the world, found itself broken, bleeding, and on the defensive. What began as Hitler's greatest gamble had turned into a nightmare of ice and death. Across the frozen Russian plains, the mighty columns that once roared eastward were now in retreat. Tanks stood abandoned, their engines frozen solid. Horses collapsed in the snow. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, desperate for warmth. As the temperatures plunged below 40°C, frostbite ate through flesh. Rifles froze to hands. Men fell asleep and never woke again. Hitler refused to believe it. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he issued his infamous order: no step back, not 1 inch. His obsession blinded him to reality. German generals begged to withdraw and regroup, but Hitler would not allow it. He saw retreat as weakness and demanded his troops hold their ground to the last bullet. Yet reality was merciless. The Red Army, fueled by vengeance and survival, pressed forward with ferocity. Soviet tanks smashed into German lines. Infantry advanced through waist-deep snow, their white uniforms blending into the landscape. Siberian divisions, armed with submachine guns and supported by T-34 tanks, overran frozen German defenses. What had once been an unstoppable force was now fighting simply to survive. For the first time since the war began, German soldiers felt fear, real fear. Letters sent home spoke not of victory, but of despair. We are dying here in the cold. Moscow is far away. The snow is endless. Tell my family I fought as long as I could. Entire units disappeared in the blizzards. Supply convoys froze on the roads, and ammunition ran out faster than it could be delivered. Even the Luftwaffe struggled. Planes couldn't take off from icy runways, and mechanics worked with bare hands until their skin cracked. But amidst the chaos, one thing became clear: the Soviet Union would not fall. Moscow had stood. Hitler's lightning war, his blitzkrieg, had failed for the first time. The cost was staggering. The Germans had suffered over 750,000 casualties by the end of 1941. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were lost. But for every German soldier who fell, the Soviets lost 3 more, yet still they fought on. Stalin's call for total war had awakened something unstoppable: the sheer willpower of a nation fighting for its life. As 1942 dawned, the Eastern Front was no longer a place of conquest. It was a graveyard. Still, Hitler refused to admit defeat. He convinced himself that Moscow's failure was only temporary, and that the next campaign, a push toward the south, would finally bring victory. But the seeds of disaster had already been sown. The Soviet winter had done what no army in Europe could do. It had humbled the Nazi war machine, and though the snow would melt in spring, the blood it covered would stain the soil forever. Winter had turned the German advance into a nightmare. But for the Soviets, that same winter became a weapon: cold, merciless, and unrelenting. By early 1942, the Red Army had stopped retreating. The spirit of survival that had carried them through the darkest months of 1941 now transformed into a ferocious will to fight back. The German army, stretched thin and frozen in place, could barely hold its lines. And that's when Stalin struck. In January 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive exploded across the entire front. From the icy forests north of Moscow to the snow-covered plains of Ukraine, millions of Soviet soldiers surged forward. Supported by T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and fierce determination, they pushed the Germans back mile by mile. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat. German commanders were stunned. Their once disciplined troops were now reduced to chaos, falling back through blizzards, abandoning equipment, and leaving their dead frozen in the snow. The Luftwaffe, grounded by ice and fog, could no longer provide air support. Soviet planes ruled the skies, raining death on retreating columns. The psychological shock was immense. The same soldiers who once believed they were invincible now whispered words that had never been spoken before: "We can't win this war." Meanwhile, inside the Soviet Union, Stalin's message was clear: no mercy, no surrender. Factories deep in the Ural Mountains thundered day and night, producing tanks, planes, and ammunition faster than ever. The entire nation had become a war machine. But the Soviet counteroffensive came at a terrible cost. The Red Army suffered catastrophic losses in men and material. In some areas, the push forward outpaced supply lines. Soldiers fought without food or proper ammunition. Still, Stalin pressed on, demanding attack after attack, believing that only unrelenting pressure could crush the German will. By March 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive had pushed the Germans back from Moscow hundreds of miles to the west. Towns and villages that had been burned to ashes were retaken. Civilians emerged from hiding, frostbitten and starving, to find nothing but ruins. The propaganda machines of both sides roared louder than ever. Berlin claimed that the retreat was a tactical withdrawal. Moscow declared that the fascists were finally being driven from sacred Russian soil. Both were partly right, and both were paying in blood. But despite the Red Army's success, the war was far from over. Hitler, enraged by the defeat at Moscow, refused to accept reality. He fired his top generals, blamed everyone but himself, and swore revenge. The failure of Barbarossa only fed his obsession. He now set his eyes on the south, on the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. There, in the ruins of that city, the fate of the entire war would soon be decided. Spring 1942. The frozen battlefields of Russia began to thaw, revealing the scars of war-shattered tanks, burnt-out villages, and the bodies of thousands who had fallen to the winter's fury. Operation Barbarossa had failed to crush the Soviet Union, but Adolf Hitler was not ready to admit defeat. Instead, he convinced himself that one final, decisive strike could still bring victory. His new target, the South, the Caucasus oil fields and the city that bore his enemy's name, Stalingrad. In Hitler's mind, capturing Stalingrad meant more than strategy. It was symbolic, a battle of names, of ideologies. To destroy Stalin's city would humiliate the Soviet leader and break the spirit of his people. And so, the next great German offensive was born, Operation Blue Fall Blau. The plan was daring, but dangerous. Instead of a united front, Hitler split his forces, sending one army toward the rich oil fields of the Caucasus, and another toward Stalingrad. On the banks of the Volga River, his generals warned him, dividing their strength could be fatal. But Hitler, intoxicated by pride, ignored them once again. As summer returned, the German war machine rolled forward once more. Thousands of tanks, aircraft, and soldiers advanced through the endless plains of southern Russia. The Luftwaffe regained control of the skies, bombarding Soviet positions with devastating precision. Villages were obliterated, rivers ran red. At first, the offensive succeeded. The Red Army, still recovering from the winter battles, fell back in confusion. Soviet defenses crumbled under the renewed German assault. Cities like Kharkov and Voronezh fell, and Hitler grew convinced that destiny was once again on his side. But beneath the victories lay cracks too deep to ignore. German supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles. Fuel and ammunition shortages worsened by the day. Soldiers were weary and overconfident, while the Soviets, learning from their mistakes, were digging in, preparing for the inevitable stand at Stalingrad. Inside the city, the atmosphere was electric with fear and determination. Civilians built barricades and trenches. Factories converted into fortresses churned out weapons under constant bombardment. The Volga River, lifeline of the city, became a death zone, bombed day and night by German aircraft. Stalin issued his most famous order: not a step back. There would be no retreat, no surrender. Every street, every building, every inch of ground would be defended with blood. As August turned to September, German bombers unleashed one of the most devastating air raids of the war. Stalingrad burned for days, engulfed in flames and smoke so thick that sunlight vanished. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the inferno. And then came the ground assault. The battle that would decide the fate of Hitler's empire had begun. The soldiers of both nations knew there would be no mercy in Stalingrad. September 1942. The city of Stalingrad stood on the western bank of the Volga River, a smoking ruin, reduced to rubble by weeks of relentless German bombing. What had once been an industrial powerhouse was now a nightmare of shattered buildings, twisted steel, and burning streets. Yet, even in the midst of destruction, the Soviet flag still flew. For the Germans, victory seemed inevitable. By late September, the Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had reached the outskirts of the city. Hitler himself ordered that Stalingrad be taken no matter the cost. He envisioned it as a symbol, the conquest that would prove the might of his empire once again. But as the Wehrmacht entered Stalingrad, they stepped into hell itself. Every block, every building, every room became a battlefield. Soviet snipers hunted German soldiers from the shadows. Machine gun nests were hidden inside crumbling factories. Sewer tunnels turned into ambush zones. Entire platoons vanished in the smoke-filled ruins of streets that had no names left. This was not the open, fast-moving war the Germans were used to. This was urban warfare, brutal, close, and merciless. The Soviets called it the War of Rats. German troops, trained for blitzkrieg, were now fighting room to room, floor to floor, with knives, grenades, and bare hands. Buildings changed hands multiple times a day, one moment held by Germans, the next reclaimed by Soviet counterattacks. The Volga River, once the city's lifeline, became a river of death. Soviet reinforcements crossed it under constant bombardment, ferried by small boats through storms of artillery and machine gun fire. Many never made it to the other side, but those who did fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. Stalin's infamous Order No. 227 echoed through the ranks. Not a step back. Retreat was forbidden. Deserters were executed. Entire divisions were ordered to hold their ground, no matter the cost. One name began to rise above the chaos: Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper who became a legend in the ruins. Hidden among the wreckage, Zaitsev hunted German officers with deadly precision, turning fear itself into a weapon. His story spread through the city, inspiring defenders to fight on even when all seemed lost. By October, the battle had turned into a living nightmare. German soldiers fought for days just to capture a single building. Places like Pavlov's house, where a small group of Soviet troops held out for nearly 2 months, defying every assault. Hitler demanded more reinforcements, but the deeper his forces pushed into the city, the more they were trapped. The Luftwaffe could no longer provide effective air support. Supplies dwindled. The Germans, surrounded by endless ruins, realized that they were bleeding slowly, one street at a time. Still, Hitler refused to retreat. He declared, "We have taken Stalingrad. The city is ours." But that was a lie. For months, the Battle of Stalingrad had raged without mercy. The city had become a graveyard of steel and stone, where entire divisions vanished in the smoke and rubble. But beneath the chaos, the Soviet High Command had been preparing something far greater than defense. They were about to strike back. This was Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack, designed to encircle the German Sixth Army and trap it inside the ruins of Stalingrad. The plan was bold, brilliant, and unexpected. While the Germans were fixated on the city center, the Soviets secretly gathered their forces far to the north and south of Stalingrad. The defenders inside the city, exhausted, starving, and surrounded, had one mission: hold on long enough for the counterblow to fall. Then, on the morning of November 19th, 1942, the frozen steppe erupted. From the north, Marshal Zhukov's armies thundered forward, tanks smashing through Romanian lines guarding the German flank. From the south, another Soviet front surged ahead, overwhelming the Italians and Hungarians supporting Hitler's army. The German High Command was stunned. These weren't weak militias or scattered units, they were fully equipped Soviet armies, attacking with unstoppable momentum. Within days, the jaws of the Soviet trap began to close. German soldiers at the front realized too late that they were being surrounded. Communications broke down, supply lines vanished. The once proud Sixth Army, the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, was suddenly cut off, isolated inside Stalingrad with no escape. Hitler's response was madness. He forbade any retreat, declaring, "The Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad will be held at all costs." He promised that the Luftwaffe would resupply the encircled troops by air, but that promise was a fantasy. Winter storms grounded planes, and Soviet anti-aircraft guns turned every flight into suicide. Barely a fraction of the needed supplies ever reached the trapped soldiers. Inside the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the situation became desperate. Tens of thousands of German soldiers huddled in cellars and basements, freezing, starving, and waiting for help that would never come. Horses were slaughtered for food, ammunition ran out, frostbite and disease spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, Soviet troops tightened the noose. Their artillery rained fire day and night. The hunters of summer had become the hunted of winter. By December 1942, one German relief force operation, Winter Storm, attempted to break through the encirclement, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. For a brief moment, hope flickered among the trapped Sixth Army, but Hitler refused to allow them to break out and join the relief. He ordered them to stay put, waiting for salvation that never came. By then, Stalingrad was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter. The fall of Stalingrad sent shockwaves through the world. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been broken. What was once a tide of steel sweeping eastward now began to flow backward. Slow at first, then unstoppable. Hitler's dream of crushing the Soviet Union in a single campaign was gone. The Red Army had not only survived, it had learned, adapted, and grown stronger. In the frozen wastelands of southern Russia, remnants of the German Sixth Army still tried to fight their way out, but it was hopeless. They were hunted across the steppe by Soviet tanks and cavalry, their corpses left scattered in the snow. Across the Eastern Front, the Soviets launched a series of devastating offensives. Operation Little Saturn followed closely behind the victory at Stalingrad, smashing through Axis lines and sending the Italian and Hungarian divisions into full retreat. What had begun as a single city's defense was now transforming into a continental counterattack. For the German High Command, it was chaos. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin, bleeding from every wound. Supply lines were collapsing, tanks were frozen solid, and men were dying faster than they could be replaced. The once disciplined German army was now fighting just to survive. But in Berlin, Hitler refused to accept reality. He dismissed his generals, pleased to withdraw, and instead screamed orders for no retreat. Every inch of Soviet soil had to be held, no matter the cost. Entire divisions were sacrificed to defend meaningless positions, their soldiers dying for ground that would be lost again within days. The myth of German superiority began to crumble. Soviet tanks, the T-34s, now outnumbered and outperformed the German panzers. Soviet industry, relocated deep inside the Ural Mountains, was producing weapons faster than the Germans could destroy them. The Red Army's generals Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konov were no longer learning from their mistakes. They were exploiting Hitler's. The winter of 1943 was brutal. German troops froze in their trenches, their uniforms in tatters, their rations gone. The once fearsome Luftwaffe could no longer control the skies. Soviet aircraft dominated, bombing German convoys and rail lines relentlessly. And then came the most painful realization of all. Germany was no longer the hunter, it was the hunted. Villages once burned by German forces were now liberated by Soviet soldiers. Civilians who had once cowered in fear now watched the Red Army push the invaders back, step by step. Still, Hitler's propaganda machine screamed promises of victory. Posters declared, "Germany will never fall," but even within the ranks of the Wehrmacht, morale had shattered. Soldiers whispered what no one dared to say aloud, that the war was lost. As spring approached, the German army limped westward, exhausted and broken. Behind them, the Soviet banner flew over the ruins of Stalingrad, waving triumphantly against the gray. January 1943, the once proud Sixth Army, Germany's finest fighting force, lay trapped and dying in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. What had begun as Hitler's grand dream of conquest had become a nightmare of defeat. The city was unrecognizable, a wasteland of shattered factories, burned-out streets, and endless graves buried under snow. The cries of the wounded echoed through the ruins. Supplies were gone. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Even bread had become a distant memory. Soldiers boiled leather belts and ate dead horses to survive another day. Inside his command bunker, General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, faced the impossible. His men were freezing, starving, and surrounded by an enemy that showed no mercy. Yet Hitler's orders were absolute. Not a step back. Stalingrad must be held. By late January, the Soviet noose had tightened completely. The city was split into small pockets, each isolated, each fighting desperately. Every street, every wall, became a battlefield. Soviet troops advanced methodically, crushing one strongpoint after another. Overhead, Soviet loudspeakers blared through the icy air. German soldiers, you are surrounded. Surrender and you will live. But Hitler's propaganda continued to promise victory. The Führer insisted that the Sixth Army would fight to the last bullet, to the last man. In Berlin, he promoted Paulus to field marshal, reminding him that no German field marshal had ever surrendered in history. The message was clear. Hitler expected him to die, but Paulus was finished. His men were dying by the thousands each day. Entire regiments ceased to exist. The wounded froze to death in makeshift shelters. The Luftwaffe's supply flights had all but stopped. There was nothing left to fight with, and no reason left to die for Hitler's pride. On January 31 Street, 1943, Paulus made the decision that would shake the Third Reich. He surrendered. Soviet soldiers burst into the basement of the department store, where his headquarters was located. Paulus, pale and exhausted, stood silently as he was taken prisoner. Around him, his officers wept in disbelief. The once invincible Sixth Army, the spearhead of Operation Barbarossa, was gone. 2 days later, the northern pocket surrendered. The battle for Stalingrad was over. Out of 300,000 German soldiers trapped in the city, only about 90,000 were captured alive. Of those, less than 6,000 would ever return home. The rest perished in Soviet captivity, victims of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. For Hitler, Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was humiliation. It shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. As news of the surrender reached Berlin, silence filled the halls of power. Goebbels ordered the radio to play solemn music. Even Hitler withdrew from public view, refusing to face the reality that his empire was crumbling from. By the summer of 1943, Hitler faced a grim reality. His armies had been beaten back across the vast steppes of Russia. Stalingrad was lost, the Eastern Front was collapsing, and morale across the Reich was at an all-time low. But in his mind, there was still a chance. One decisive victory that could destroy the Soviet momentum and restore German dominance in the East. That chance, he believed, lay in a place called Kursk. The city of Kursk sat at the center of a massive, Soviet-held bulge in the front line, a 150-mile-wide curve stretching deep into German territory. Hitler's generals saw it as a perfect target for a pincer attack. If they could cut off the bulge from both north and south, they might trap and annihilate the Soviet forces inside. Hitler called it Operation Citadel. It would be the largest tank battle in history, the ultimate clash between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The plan was ambitious, but dangerously delayed. Hitler postponed the offensive several times, waiting for new weapons, the Tiger and Panther tanks, to arrive. Each delay gave the Soviets precious time to dig in, to build defenses that stretched for hundreds of miles, minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery zones, and hidden bunkers. By the time the Germans finally attacked in July 1943, the Red Army was ready. When the first German panzers rolled forward, they met a storm of fire. Soviet artillery lit up the horizon. Machine guns rattled like thunder. Anti-tank mines ripped through the German columns, and entire armored divisions were shredded before they could reach their targets. The battle raged for days, a grinding, mechanical apocalypse. Tanks clashed at point-blank range, steel against steel, the air filled with black smoke and the roar of engines. The ground trembled under the weight of thousands of machines locked in combat. At Prokhorovka, one of the fiercest tank battles of all time erupted. Hundreds of T-34s and Tiger tanks collided in a single valley, a chaotic, brutal struggle where visibility dropped to nothing, and survival depended on instinct alone. The Soviet tank crews fought with ferocity, ramming German armor, firing at close range, sacrificing everything to halt the Nazi advance. By mid-July, the outcome was clear. The Germans had thrown their last reserves into the fight and gained almost nothing. Their armored spearheads were destroyed, their morale shattered. Then, news came that Allied forces had landed in Sicily, forcing Hitler to call off Operation Citadel and divert troops to defend southern Europe. Kursk was the final nail in the coffin of Germany's eastern ambitions. From that moment on, the Germans would never again launch a major offensive in the east. The Red Army seized the initiative and began pushing westward, relentlessly, village by village, city by city, toward Poland, toward Berlin. After the disaster at Kursk, the tide of war on the Eastern Front turned completely. The once invincible German army was now in retreat, fighting a desperate and losing battle against the relentless advance of the Red Army. For Hitler, Kursk had been his last hope to regain control, but instead of victory, it marked the beginning of the end. In the months that followed, Soviet forces launched a wave of powerful offensives. The Germans, still clinging to their shattered lines, were driven westward across the vast plains they had once conquered so easily. Villages, towns, and cities that had fallen in 1941 were now being liberated one by one. The Soviet counteroffensive was not just about reclaiming land, it was about revenge. Every mile retaken was soaked in blood. Every burned house, every murdered civilian, fueled the soldiers' rage. The Red Army fought with fire in its heart and vengeance in its eyes. By late 1943, Soviet forces had recaptured Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkov, dealing another devastating blow to Hitler's Eastern Front. The German lines cracked under the sheer pressure. Their troops were exhausted, short of supplies, and demoralized. Meanwhile, Soviet production was booming. Factories hidden deep within the Ural Mountains were churning out tanks, planes, and artillery faster than ever before. For every tank the Germans destroyed, the Soviets built 5 more. For every German soldier that fell, 10 fresh Soviet recruits took his place. The balance of power had shifted completely. Still, Hitler refused to face the truth. He ranted and screamed at his generals, demanding impossible counterattacks. Cities were to be defended to the last man. No retreat, no surrender. But his commands no longer inspired loyalty. They inspired despair. German soldiers were now fighting for survival, not for victory. The vast open plains of Russia, that had once seemed to promise glory, were now endless graves. The frozen ground was littered with burned-out tanks, broken helmets, and the bones of fallen men. The Soviets, meanwhile, fought with renewed confidence. Commanders like Zhukov and Konov had mastered the art of war. Their offensives were coordinated, relentless, and merciless. By early 1944, the Red Army crossed the Dnieper River and liberated Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. The cheers of freed civilians echoed through the ruins, proof that the Nazi war machine could bleed and could be beaten. In Berlin, Hitler grew increasingly paranoid and isolated. He refused to listen to his generals and began relying on fantasy instead of strategy. Maps on his walls showed armies that no longer existed, divisions that had been destroyed months earlier. He still believed he could turn the tide, but history had already chosen its course. The German army was now fighting a defensive war, step by step, mile by mile, as the Red Army thundered ever westward. The once proud conquerors were now the conquered. By 1944, the Eastern Front was no longer a front, it was a full-scale collapse. The German army, once feared and unstoppable, was now broken, retreating under the crushing weight of the Soviet advance. From Stalingrad to Kursk, from Kharkov to Kiev, the Red Army had reclaimed everything that Hitler had stolen. Now, they were pushing beyond the Soviet borders into Eastern Europe, into Poland, into the very heart of the Nazi Empire. The march westward was relentless. Soviet tanks rolled across the plains of Belarus, their guns thundering. German defenses crumbled in the face of overwhelming firepower. Cities like Minsk, Vilnius, and Lvov fell one after another. Entire German armies were encircled and annihilated. The Soviets called it Operation Bagration, a massive offensive. Launched in the summer of 1944, it was the revenge for Operation Barbarossa, swift, devastating, and unstoppable. In just weeks, the Germans lost more men and equipment than they had during the entire Battle of France in 1940. For the first time, the Red Army crossed into lands that had once been part of the Third Reich. The tide of war had turned into a flood. Everywhere they went, Soviet soldiers found evidence of Nazi brutality: concentration camps, burned villages, mass graves. The horrors of occupation fueled their fury. To them, Berlin wasn't just a city, it was the beating heart of evil itself, and it had to fall. In Berlin, Hitler raged. His once mighty Wehrmacht was shattered, yet he refused to accept defeat. He dismissed generals who told him the truth, replaced them with loyal fanatics, and dreamed of miracle weapons that would change the war's course. But those weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, came too late, and in too few numbers to make a difference. By early 1945, the Red Army had crossed the Oder River just 70 kilometers from Berlin. The city trembled under the distant roar of Soviet artillery. The Nazi capital, once the center of a vast empire, was now surrounded by ruins and fear. German civilians fled west, terrified of Soviet vengeance. Entire villages were abandoned, roads filled with endless columns of refugees and broken soldiers. But for the Red Army, this was not just conquest, it was justice. They had marched from the ashes of Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin. Millions had died, entire cities had burned. But the Soviet Union had survived, and now it was about to deliver the final blow. April 1945. The city of Berlin, once the proud capital of Hitler's empire, now lay in ruins. Bombed day and night by the Allies, its skyline was a skeleton of shattered buildings and burning rubble. The streets were filled with desperate civilians, wounded soldiers, and the echoes of approaching artillery. The Red Army had finally arrived. After nearly 4 years of brutal war, the Soviet forces stood at the gates of Berlin, ready to deliver the final blow to Nazi Germany. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945. More than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, stormed the last German defenses along the Oder River. The thunder of artillery was deafening, the largest bombardment in human history. For the German defenders, there was nowhere left to run. Inside the city, Hitler's last followers prepared for the inevitable. Old men and young boys, the Volkssturm militia, were handed rifles and told to fight to the death. Nazi propaganda promised salvation, but everyone knew the truth. The Third Reich was dying. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army advanced. Fierce fighting erupted at every intersection. Soviet tanks blasted through barricades while German snipers fought from the shadows of destroyed apartments. The smell of smoke and blood filled the air. As the battle raged, Adolf Hitler hid in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Above him, his empire was collapsing. His generals reported that all hope was lost, yet he refused to surrender. In his madness, he still believed that fate would save him, that Germany would rise again. But even his closest followers no longer believed his words. By April 30th, Soviet troops were within a few hundred meters of the bunker. Hitler, realizing the end had come, made his final decision. He married Eva Braun, dictated his last will, and then, rather than face capture, took his own life. The dictator who had unleashed hell upon the world died in the ruins of his own creation. The next day, Soviet soldiers stormed the Reich Chancellery. They found silence and the stench of death. The war in Europe was effectively over. On May 2, 1945, the German forces in Berlin officially surrendered. A few days late, on May 8, Germany's unconditional surrender was signed. Victory in Europe Day. The nightmare of World War II was finally ending. But the cost was unimaginable. More than 25 million Soviets were dead. Entire cities lay in ashes. Families were gone forever. Yet, for the Soviet soldiers raising the red flag over the Reichstag, the moment was not just victory, it was vengeance, justice, and survival. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand invasion of the East, had begun with arrogance and ended with annihilation. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12, and from the frozen fields of Stalingrad to the smoking ruins of Berlin, history had delivered its final verdict: evil never triumphs forever. The guns had fallen silent. Berlin was in ruins. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was over. But for the millions who had survived Operation Barbarossa, the end of fighting did not bring peace, only silence, grief, and the overwhelming task of rebuilding a shattered world. The Eastern Front had been the largest and bloodiest theater of war in human history. From June 22, 1941, when German troops first crossed the Soviet border, to May 1945, when the Red Army entered Berlin, the conflict had claimed the lives of more than 30 million people, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire cities had been erased. Villages turned to dust. Fields once green with life were now graveyards of steel. For Germany, Barbarossa was not just a military defeat, it was a moral and spiritual collapse. The Nazi dream of a vast empire in the East, of racial domination and endless conquest, had ended in total ruin. The armies that had once marched with confidence into Russia now lay buried beneath the soil they tried to conquer. For the Soviet Union, victory came at a terrible price. The war had ravaged its land and its people. More than 25 million Soviet citizens were dead. Thousands of towns and villages were destroyed. But the victory also forged something new: a fierce national pride. and the unbreakable image of the Soviet soldier who had stood against the Nazi storm and prevailed. The world looked upon the ruins and realized the true scale of Hitler's mistake. Operation Barbarossa, meant to secure Nazi domination, had instead unleashed destruction that consumed Europe itself. When German prisoners of war marched through Moscow in 1945, the people watched in silence, not with cheers, but with weary disbelief. Even victory could not erase the pain. In the West, Allied soldiers liberated the concentration camps, the ultimate evidence of the evil that Barbarossa had unleashed. The Holocaust, fueled by Nazi ideology, had spread across the lands conquered in the East. Millions of innocent men, women, and children had been murdered simply because of who they were. Now, those same lands were free again, but forever scarred. In the ashes of the war, new borders were drawn. The Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, its armies now occupying much of Eastern Europe. The United States and Britain, victorious, yet wary, watched from the West. The old alliance that had defeated Hitler began to fracture, giving birth to a new conflict, the Cold War. But beneath the politics and the power struggles, one truth remained. Operation Barbarossa was more than just a battle. It was a lesson, a warning to the world of what happens when hatred, pride, and ambition go unchecked. The men who fought there, on both sides, had seen the worst humanity could become. And though the war ended in 1945, its echoes would haunt generations to come. The fields of Stalingrad, the ruins of Kursk, the ashes of Berlin, all stand as silent reminders of Hitler's greatest. War is not only fought on battlefields, it is fought in the hearts of those who live through it and those who never return. As the guns of Operation Barbarossa thundered across the vast plains of Eastern Europe, millions of ordinary people were caught in the storm. Farmers, mothers, children, all became part of a war they never chose. Entire villages vanished in a matter of days. German air raids bombed civilian convoys fleeing east. Soviet troops, retreating under orders, burned their own crops and towns in a desperate attempt to deny the invaders any shelter. This was total war, and no one was spared. By the winter of 1941, the front stretched for over 1,800 miles, a living nightmare of fire and blood. Temperatures plunged to -40. Frostbite and hunger claimed more soldiers than bullets. The German army, unprepared for such brutal conditions, suffered terribly. Their fuel froze, their weapons jammed, and their morale crumbled. Yet, still, they fought, driven by orders, propaganda, and fear of retreat. On the Soviet side, civilians endured unthinkable suffering. Entire populations were evacuated to Siberia. Children as young as 10 worked in factories, producing ammunition and tanks to feed the front. Women became the lifeline of the nation. Farmers, nurses, and even snipers defending their homeland. Every town, liberated or conquered, came with a price. In the aftermath of battle, the bodies of soldiers lay frozen in the snow, their faces unrecognizable, their stories untold. Behind the lines, the Nazi occupation unleashed one of the darkest chapters in human history. Villages were burned. Entire Jewish communities were wiped out. Mass executions became routine. In cities like Kyiv, Minsk, and Smolensk, tens of thousands were rounded up and shot. The Einsatzgruppen, Hitler's mobile killing squads, followed the Wehrmacht, leaving behind fields of corpses. This was not just a war for land, it was a war of annihilation. For the Soviet people, survival itself became an act of resistance. Families hid in forests, shared scraps of bread, and prayed for the day the Red Army would return. Many never lived to see it. Even after victory, the scars remained. Every family had lost someone, a father, a son, a brother, a mother. The war had stolen an entire generation. And yet, amid the horror, stories of courage shone through the darkness. A nurse who carried wounded soldiers under fire, a soldier who gave his last piece of bread to a starving child, a mother who refused to abandon her home, standing defiant as the flames closed in. These were not heroes of legend. They were ordinary people who refused to surrender their humanity in the face of hell. When history speaks of Barbarossa, it often speaks of strategy, tanks, and battles. But behind every number was a name. Behind every city destroyed was 1,000 stories never told. This, the human cost of war, was Hitler's greatest and most unforgivable mistake. By late 1942, after the bitter winter and the costly German advances, the Soviets began to strike back with a precision and force that would change the course of the war. The defeat at Stalingrad had broken the morale of the Wehrmacht. Hitler's obsession with holding ground had left German forces overextended, supply lines stretched thin, and entire divisions vulnerable. The Red Army, having endured unimaginable losses, had learned, adapted, and grown stronger. In November 1942, Operation Uranus was launched, a massive Soviet counteroffensive aimed at encircling the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. The northern and southern flanks, held mostly by Axis allies, Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians, were weak and unprepared. Soviet tanks and infantry smashed through these lines, trapping nearly 300,000 German soldiers inside the city. This encirclement marked the first major turning point on the Eastern Front. German soldiers, once the hunters, became the hunted. Supplies dwindled, frostbite and starvation took hold, and Hitler's refusal to allow retreat condemned his army to annihilation. Meanwhile, in other sectors, the Soviets launched a series of coordinated offensives, reclaiming territories previously lost. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, the Germans attempted a counterstroke, Operation Citadel, but were decisively repelled. Thousands of tanks clashed across open fields, but Soviet defensive depth, anti-tank lines, and relentless infantry assaults held firm. The victory at Kursk allowed the Soviets to seize the initiative permanently. From that moment onward, they dictated the pace of war. Villages and cities that had been under Nazi occupation since 1941 were liberated. The Red Army began its westward push, gradually reclaiming Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Hitler, meanwhile, increasingly relied on propaganda and delusions of victory. He refused to acknowledge reality, ordering defensive stands that sacrificed thousands of men for minimal strategic value. The Wehrmacht's retreat was chaotic and brutal, leaving behind scorched earth and destroyed infrastructure. The tide had turned. The Soviets, once on the defensive, now surged with momentum that would never be reversed. From Stalingrad to Kursk, from Ukraine to Belarus, every victory strengthened their resolve. This counteroffensive was more than a military operation. It was a psychological blow to the Germans. For the first time, the Wehrmacht faced a relentless, capable enemy that could not be intimidated or outmaneuvered. The myth of German invincibility, built on blitzkrieg and early victories, was shattered forever. By mid-1944, the Red Army's advance was unstoppable, setting the stage for the liberation of Poland, the capture of Berlin, and the final collapse of the Third Reich. Operation Barbarossa, meant to crush the Soviet Union, had instead created the conditions for Germany's ultimate defeat. By 1944, the momentum had completely shifted. The Red Army, having decisively repelled the German advance at Stalingrad and Kursk, was now advancing relentlessly westward. Eastern Europe, once under the iron grip of Nazi occupation, was finally being liberated. The liberation began in Ukraine, where Soviet forces pushed the Germans back across rivers and destroyed entire pockets of resistance. Cities like Kiev, Lviv, and Kharkov were freed, but at a terrible cost. The countryside was scarred by scorched villages, destroyed bridges, and the remnants of battles that had claimed tens of thousands of lives. The Soviets' advance was methodical. They moved in armored spearheads, backed by infantry and overwhelming artillery. German soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, were in constant retreat. Entire divisions surrendered or were annihilated. In Belarus, Operation Bagration, struck in June 1944, it was one of the largest offensives of the war, destroying the German Army Group Center almost entirely. In mere weeks, the Soviets liberated Minsk and forced a retreat toward Poland, leaving behind countless wrecked tanks, destroyed vehicles, and thousands of bodies, a testament to both the ferocity of the fighting and the scale of Hitler's mistake. The liberation of the Baltic states followed, as the Soviets pushed northward, reclaiming Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Here, the Red Army faced fierce resistance from entrenched German forces and local collaborators, but the momentum was unstoppable. Cities and towns that had suffered years under Nazi rule finally breathed the air of freedom. Every liberated city told the same story: suffering, vengeance, and the cost of Hitler's ambitions. Civilians, many of whom had endured forced labor, starvation, and the terror of occupation, welcomed the Red Army as liberators. But liberation came with its own horrors. The front lines were bloody, homes were destroyed, and the war had left deep scars on the land and its people. As the Soviets crossed into Poland, the war in the east was clearly nearing its final stage. German defenses were collapsing, their soldiers exhausted and hopeless. Hitler's refusal to retreat had left the Reich vulnerable. The German army no longer had the strength to resist the advance of the Red Army. The liberation of Eastern Europe was both a military and moral victory. The people who had suffered under the Nazi yoke could finally breathe again. Yet, the victory was shadowed by the human cost. Millions of civilians had died. Cities lay in ruins, and the memories of atrocities would haunt generations. From Stalingrad to Berlin, from Ukraine to the Baltics, Operation Barbarossa, initially a symbol of German aggression and confidence, had become a monument to Hitler's catastrophic miscalculations. The march of the Red Army through Eastern Europe was unstoppable. The hunters had become the hunted, the invaders had become the defeated.